Hello there, and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another project. Today I'm going to be doing my best to replicate this design from Butterick Pattern magazine that I showed recently last month here on the channel. I'll put a card up to the video where I flipped through this magazine, but we all heard me ooh and all over this dress, and if you follow me on Instagram, that week I was really delving into how the heck this was done, and I couldn't exactly find the answers on my own, so I had to open it up to the internet at large. And thankfully, many people sent in images of their 1940s patterns with this sort of detail, showing that they were indeed, these waist pieces were indeed cut on the straight grain, which is what I thought after seeing the image of the back of this Butterick pattern. This Butterick pattern seems to be pretty rare because I've only found a few listings for it online and they were all sold. It seems like in the 30s, this sort of waist midriff piece was more likely to be cut on the bias, and then through the 40s it kind of switched over. But seeing as my research and my pattern drafting books couldn't help me parse out this design, for some reason nobody seemed to have this yoke that encompasses the waist seam. So the waist seam, the princess line, anything going on in the waist is eliminated. So this Butterick design at least has a center front seam, but a lot of times you see these without even a center front seam. It's just a waist piece that encompasses both like a top yoke and a skirt yoke, but without a seam. And I just couldn't figure out how they were drafting this, from which blocks they were drafting it from. I knew there had to be an official method, and I just couldn't find it, and that was really frustrating me, honestly. But luckily I was sent this image from obviously the late 80s or early 90s, this sketch here showing a very similar waist piece to these 1940s designs. Of course, the 80s did a lot of copying of 1940s stylistic details and style in general. So this is kind of an 80s does 40s version of this design, but I will take it. I needed to know how this waist piece was drafted, and here is at least one way it can be done. So thank you to Swingularity for sending me that image and for finding this, because I was really at a loss as to why no drafting books ever seem to cover this design. But using these diagrams from this book as a kind of starting place, I cobbled together a couple of different versions of this, went through a couple of rounds of mock-ups to perfect this design. I'll show you how I got on over on the Blue Patterning Table of Doom, as always. So here is that image again from the drafting book, where we can see in this diagram how they're going about achieving these three separate pieces: the top of the bodice, the mid-waist piece, and then the skirt piece. And to create this waist piece, they are using a hip-length sloper, a sloper that has a double-ended dart as opposed to the regular slopers. So the first thing I'll have to do is make my two-piece slopers, my bodice and skirt, into something that is more like this with a double-ended dart in the center to be able to follow this diagram more closely. So I went ahead and gave this a try, just kind of off camera here, and tried making this pattern this way to see if I could cobble something together and if it would work at all. And this was the first mock-up from that experiment. So you can see we are going in the right direction. So I was very pleased with this as a first mock-up, but I thought I could improve upon the situation. So let's jump on over and I'll show you how I got this far and how I'm going to improve it for the next version. So here I am with my basic bodice block front and some spare paper. I'm going to go ahead and trace this as a place to start with. Of course, I'm kind of going to be creating the double darted hip length sloper first here, so if that's something you're curious about, you will see me do a kind of slapdash version of that here first. It could be refined a little bit further, and this isn't the official way to do this. This is my way to do this, so, you know, follow my advice with caution, I suppose. But here I'm just drawing in my regular sloper. I'm going to draw a line up into the shoulder because we're going to open this waist dart up and take a little bit of the dart fullness out and put it up into the shoulder just to wait its turn up there in the shoulder. I'm going to draw a straight line out from the center front here, even though I'm going to be cutting this out, but I'm going to use the rest of this paper in a minute here. So I'm just going to square off a line to use later, and then I will cut this out so that I can again close that waist dart a little bit up into the shoulder. My markings for my side dart are still here on my basic block. I'm just going to leave them chilling there for now. I don't need them right now. I'm not worrying about the side dart at this current time. I will just go ahead and cut everything else out first. I'm going to put the center front seam on these two pieces as well here. So this scratch paper here, I'll put a 1/2 inch center front seam allowance on there, and then I'll add that seam allowance onto the bodice block here, just because this is going to have a center front seam eventually, like the Butterick design. So I'm going to open up this line into the shoulder and open up one of my dart legs down here. These are all both going straight up into the apex, of course. And then I will layer this stuff together here. So I need to know what the dart fullness of my skirt front here is, and that is 1 inch for each dart, so 2 inches. So I need to make this dart on the waist here of the bodice. I need to lower that, or reduce that dart fullness to 2 inches so that it matches the fullness I need for the skirt. That way I can just make that into one dart here at the waist for both the skirt and the bodice by combining them. Here I have lined this up incorrectly, so watch me realize that and then unstick that and put it where it's supposed to be. Honestly. Kid, you're on camera. Try and behave. So now I've reduced that, again, you can see the extra dart fullness is opened up into the shoulder so that my waist dart is down to 2 inches. Therefore, it will match up with my skirt. So if I hold my pencil skirt pattern up here, I can line that up along the center front, and I can trace the side over here, and it lines up pretty dang well. It overlaps a tiny bit at the waist, but not bad. Now my darts here on the front are 5 3/4 long on my skirt, or the center dart is, and so I'm going to square off a line straight through this top dart on the bodice and come down 5 3/4 inch, and then draw in the skirt dart. So this is the same amount of fullness as the 2 darts on my skirt normally is, just taken out in 1 dart that matches up with the bodice dart like this. So I'm just going to smooth off the side seam a little bit here. This is my piece from my first mock-up version, my version 2, as you can see. This is version 3 that I'm working on now for you. And so I just wanted to make the corsety shape, the yoke, the waist bit, of a similar shape here. So I'm starting off just using that. I didn't do this in any official way. The first time I just chose where to draw it, and now I'm going to make changes based off of that first mock-up. This is the kind of design where I definitely suggest making mock-ups. So I'm going to swoop these lines a little bit. So I kept them straight like this for that first mock-up, and I'm going to swoop them into a more corsety shape here. I think this looks like you're wearing a corset over a dress almost. That's what I think this design kind of looks like, or it hints at that sort of thing. It's almost like a Swiss waist kind of detail, although of course not actually cinching in any way. It just is giving the illusion. So now you want the line on either side, because this is an angle where it intersects with the dart, you want to make it so that the line will meet up once the dart is closed. Hopefully you'll see what I mean once I layer this. To create this little waist piece, I am going to have to leave some of this dart fullness in. You'll see what I mean in just a moment. But I'm just deciding exactly on the placement of this line here and what shape I want. You can draw in whatever shape you want. You can make the line curve a different direction. You can make it straight like that first line I drew. Whatever you'd like. You can also just draw a wide, straight waistband across this area too, if you want to. But of course I went for this angle design because I was copying the Butterick situation. And then you connect the lines here through the dart like this. So we draw straight lines here through those points so that the dart can be closed for the most part through the center here. Now if you have a normal person amount of dart fullness, which whatever that means, I have a lot of dart fullness because I have a full bust adjustment in the front. My bust to waist measurement is like 10 inches different, more than 10 inches different. So I have a big waist dart normally. So this, closing this up does not close up all of my dart fullness. So you'll see what I mean when I cut this waist bit apart. So I'm going to cut here along that straight line I drew and then layer this closed. So you'll see what I mean here. I'm just going to layer that closed. But even though I'm lining up those straight lines, I still had this little bit of dart in here because I'm not overlapping it extra, or I'm like being conservative about my overlap because that's how the diagram says to do it, honestly. Now you can take some of this excess out of this center front seam because we have a center front seam, might as well use it. So let's take about a 1/2 inch out along that center front seam to create almost another double-ended dart that is along this center seam here. So because we have that seam there, we might as well utilize it to take out some of this extra fullness that has been left in the center dart there, or the dart that's in the side, I guess. And then out of the side seam here, we can also take out another 1/4 inch and just cinch that down through the side as well. So because that fullness had been left in where I overlapped that main dart in the center, I could utilize the side seam and the center front seam to take out a little bit more of that if I should so desire. We will watch me add some of that fullness back in later because I went a little bit overboard here. Now let me cut off the excess from my skirt portion piece here, and you can kind of get an idea of what we're looking at. This is the front version 3, waist version 3, skirt front version 3. And I do need to add seam allowance between all these pieces because I've cut them all apart and they will need to be sewn back together. So let me go ahead and start adding seam allowance to all of this as well. And then I can go ahead and make this skirt piece into an A-line because we don't want to keep this little dart here and keep it a pencil skirt. I want to flare it into an A-line. So let me add seam allowance here. I'm going to smooth this off just a little bit as I cut this. I'm like adding a tiny bit above the dart. It's fine. No one will know other than us. Again, I'm just going to square off down from that dart all the way so I can cut up into the dart and swing this open like you would an A-line skirt. Like so. And I can tape this shut. Now normally when you make an A-line skirt from the pencil skirt pattern, you're closing 2 different darts. So this still needs a little bit more flare, but that's the kind of thing we are going to work on last with this pattern. We have more things to figure out before then. And as I'm working on this, I'm just going through each piece and adding on the seam allowance I need, and so I should finish up this top pattern as well. So my dart, again, is still sitting in here, so let me draw in that side dart that's been here the whole time, but I'm going to close the rest of this nonsense into another side dart here, because the Butterick pattern has 2 side darts, so I'm going to copy that as well. So I'm going to close this back up again. It was just there to facilitate moving around the nonsense to make that double-ended dart to match the rest up with the skirt at the waist, but now I don't need that anymore, and I don't need this waist dart at all, actually, so let's go ahead and close it entirely. So I'm closing the fullness that we moved into the shoulder for a minute, we don't need it up there, closing it out of the waist, and just opening both of those up into this side dart instead, so I can have 2 side darts over here that point, of course, towards the apex, like all darts. And let me see what shape I need this to be. Again, I need to come out 1 1/4 inches from my apex. Again, the standard device, I believe, is 5/8. I go with 1 1/4 inches. That's just what I need for my personal shape. And the style of undergarments I wear and stuff like that. So that's just what works best for me, is 1 1/4 inches. So now I can go ahead and add my seam allowance along this piece. So I've added the seam allowance at the top of the skirt piece along both sides of the waist piece, but I needed to be able to finish my pattern drafting on this top piece, moving the rest of the dart fullness into that second side dart to be able to finish off this top piece before I can add the seam allowance on. Now for the back, we're going to do a similar series of adjustments here. So again, I have this dart, it's about 2 inches. I need to make the skirt dart, again, about 2 inches. Mine's about 2 1/4 inches, so I end up taking 1/4 inch off the side and just leaving that 2 inch dart in the center again. And I measured down how long my darts are in the back. And again, I squared off through the center of this dart in the bodice, like so. And then my dart comes down the same length that my darts normally do on the skirt. But because this dart here on the skirt is only 2 inches, I'm going to take off 1/4 inch over here on the side, where I smooth this out, and this does overlap a little bit more, so I will have to make sure I'm walking all my seams and making sure that everything is the correct length before I sew this all together. So again, taking my front waist piece, I'm just going to mark the side seams of this so that the piece across the back can be the same width, so it meets up at the side seam. Here I'm just going to come straight across the bodice and then slightly curve this right below the waist. So we just have a little bit of a wider waistband across the back here, just to match up with the front. You, of course, could just only do the front if you want to do. I've seen actually quite a few of these 40s patterns where only the front has the corset-y shaped, like funny yoke bit, and the back is just a normal back. So you don't have to do the back. Heck, you don't have to do anything, honestly. But here we are today, getting a little bit tricky, huh? I will go ahead and start cutting these pieces apart here, just cutting out a little half skirt here. This is because I'm just mocking everything up. I don't want to cut out, you know, a full skirt of muslin and waste the mock-up material. I'm just going to cut this out just past my hips. But I will cut off the extra here. This is my center back. And again, I can cut through these darts, layer the straight portion closed, and I'll be left with a little bit of dart fullness that doesn't get taken out. Once again, I can scoot this off either the center back or the side seam. So I can take a little bit off the side, or I can take a little bit off the center back if I want to. Because I'm putting a center back zipper in, I don't really want to mess with the center back. I'll keep it straight. So I'll just take a tiny bit off the side. This is, of course, going to need seam allowance. Once again, that's what I'm indicating to myself here, so hopefully I won't forget. Cutting this out. Separating the, you know, making basically a one-piece front and back block, and then separating into 3 pieces where I have a top, a waist, and then a skirt portion. Again, I need to cut off some excess here. Again, all of these need seam allowance in between them, so I'll go ahead and put that on as well. Don't forget your seam allowance. You will be very sad when you go to try on your mock-up if it doesn't have seam allowance. Everything will be shorter and smaller. Once again, with this skirt piece in the back, I do need to open it up just like I did with the front to flare it into that A-line again, so I will have to do that as well. Now, there is one more piece for this pattern here, or replicating this design. I'm doing this a little bit differently than Butterick does, even though I said I was going to be copying Butterick quite directly. I'm doing this drape across the top front as an additional layer, additional piece that is sewn on. It's got like a net underlayer, I think it's suggesting, and the front pieces are kind of wackily shaped. I would rather just layer on a whole separate layer and leave it loose across the front. You'll see what I mean when you see my dress in the end. I think it looks nice this way. I just prefer it this way, so this is how we're doing it. So I've traced a mirrored copy of my top of my front piece here. I'm transferring my apex on, my darts on, all that jazz, so that I can create an asymmetric piece. That's why I need to trace the whole front like this, mirrored along the center front, so I can create something asymmetric. So I have my darts drawn in on one side, and I'm going to close one of these darts. You'll watch me close both, but I'm going to end up using only one of fullness, up into the shoulder, and then draw the curve across the front of the bodice like this, down from that shoulder to the waist on the other side. So we're creating this shape so that we can have this overlay. Now, they leave their darts in there, so that's not how they're creating, again, this is not how they're doing the fullness of this piece either. I'm going to be closing one of my darts and using the dart fullness in the other side asymmetrically. That's not how Butterick did it. They added in extra fullness without utilizing these darts. They just kept these darts. But like, why not sew one less dart if we can? You know what I'm saying? Like, we're going to have to sew lots of darts anyway. We might as well sew one less of them and use that fullness to create the fullness in the shoulder here. So that's what I'm going to do today here. So I can cut this off now. We have our asymmetric piece. Now I can open up these darts up into this shoulder. There's no reason I can't. You can always take the dart fullness from one side and throw it into the other by doing something like this, I suppose. You could do this with a full bodice if you wanted to. Have all of the gathering up in one shoulder. You could close all 4 darts on the front of the bodice, or 2 if you have only 2 darts in your bodice, and put all the fullness in one seam if you wanted to. Now, because of the nature of geometry and angles, when you close up these darts over here, because they have a larger distance to cover, going all the way across the pattern like this, it opens up into quite a lot of fullness. In fact, in the end, I end up deciding that this is too much fullness, and my fabric today is a little bit thick, so this was going to be too much to gather down into one little shoulder, so that's why I closed both darts here, but later on we will see me close one up again, because it's just too much. This is a lot. If you had like a thin chiffon, like a very, very floopy fabric that was thin, you could get away with this much gathering up in the shoulder. But I think today my rayon crepe that I'll be using to make this dress, weirdly enough, is actually a nice medium to heavy weight rayon crepe, which is so hard to find nowadays. Mine, by the way, was from the fabric that I'll be using for most of this today, was from the red tag sale section at Joann's 5 or 6 years ago, maybe more. Could be 8 years ago, 10 years ago. I've had it in my stash a very long time, so you'll see me using rayon crepe later to make the dress, and I'm sorry you cannot get any, and I can't get any more. It's a bummer. But now that I have version 3 of my pattern here, I'm going to go ahead and lay that out on muslin fabric, some cotton mock-up fabric, and test it out just to make sure I've gotten the exact design I want finally before I start cutting out of that rayon fabric I can't get any more of, for example. So I'm going to cut all this out on the straight grain, so I'm lining this up with parallel to selvage. Nothing is being cut on the bias here, it's all being cut on the straight grain. And here is my final muslin for this. This is actually the 3rd muslin of this design that I made. And I'm finally really close to where I want to be with this. So I'm going to make a few tiny more changes and then we will cut this pattern out. But as for my final changes here, I'm going to again close one of the darts in this additional piece here, like I mentioned. But I'm also going to add on, I took out a 1/2 inch from the center front of this corsetty piece. I'm just calling it that for lack of a better word, okay? This waist piece here. I'm going to add on a 1/4 inch back. So I took out a 1/2 inch and I'm just going to leave it at a 1/4. So I'm putting a 1/4 inch back on to the center front of this. Just might as well leave this a tiny bit looser. Why not? Just trying to perfect my fit here. I'm used to things fitting tighter, honestly. So it's kind of out of my comfort zone to leave this a little bit floopier, but that's right. We'll make it work today. So I can set those waist pieces aside. Of course, I need to extend my skirt pieces also. Oh, I was just talking to myself about how I need to add a 1/4 inch along the center back. It's fine. We got it. Good. Yep, check. Okay. So these skirt pieces, I need to make them full length because right now they're these little shorties. So I just want to make sure that they are the same length and at least the same fullness or more as my regular A-line skirt pieces. So here I'm taking another piece of paper here so I can tape these on and extend the length of these skirt pieces because right now they're just little shorties for mocking this up, but of course I need to extend them all the way. So I'm flaring the side a little bit out from the skirt, and then the rest of this I will just continue as is, just longer. And I'm going to kind of hold up the waist design so I can see where the original waistline was to make sure that this is 29 inches long, I think is what I make this. I might have made it 30, I don't remember. I think I made it 30 just out of ease. But I'm just basically making an A-line skirt using this piece as a starting point. And then I just hold up my A-line skirt, my regular one. This is the front, you need the back. There you go. The back, just to make sure this flares at least as much as this and like it has enough width in the hip and everything is working out. Okay, so I'm holding that up, seeing what's going on. So I think I needed a tiny bit more width in the hip here, just comparing it to my A-line skirt. You know, once again, this is a more involved project. I would recommend this not be your first project with pattern drafting, for example. So it's a little bit more extra. And again, if you're going to do this much of a change, even just changing from darts to princess seams, I usually recommend making a mock-up, but this is changing from darts to all kinds of nonsense. So definitely mock this one up. But I need to extend the front skirt portions the same as well, so I will go ahead and do that. I I am going to go ahead and trace some facings to finish the neckline of this as well, because I will not be lining this dress. Again, it's on the thicker side, this fabric. I didn't want to do a full lining in this. There's no need to, really, because the fabric isn't itchy or anything in any way. If this was a wool crepe, maybe I would have. I'm just tracing on some facings here. You've seen me do this here on the channel several times, including in that how to finish a neckline video that I made more recently. So here's a front facing that I can cut on the fold here. And then I will do the same for the back, just trace a back facing as well, just so I can finish this neckline with a little bit more of the rayon crepe that I'll be using today. If only Joann's carry that rayon crepe normally. It's like a bottom weight rayon crepe. If they had it in black. Also, you know what I'm really looking forward right now is purple, because I don't have enough plum and like burgundy in my closet. And I'd like some plum colored things or eggplant colored things. Aubergine for the Brits out there. Things in my closet. So I've been looking for rayon crepe in purple recently, but I haven't been able to find any that isn't like bright purple. And no, I'm not a bright person. Let's face it. I mean, I love neon in general, but in small doses on myself, yeah. Anyway, I'm opening one of those darts back up here in this top drape portion. I'm just going to open up one of the darts on the side so that this is a little bit less gathered on this side here, because it was just going to be too much, honestly. So I'm keeping one of the darts. Butterick kept both. You know, again, this is copying the Butterick design, but still adapting it to my blocks and my body and my taste, I suppose. Let me take down some of my floops back here so my pattern piece will behave a little bit better. So now this is going to get gathered down to the shoulder still, and this dart will need to be sewn, so I'm going to go ahead and mark 1¼ inch out from my apex over here and just draw on those dart legs. And I can use my awl to poke through those so that I'll be able to transfer them onto my fabric later with colored pencil, of course, because it's me. Alright, so now I have everything ready to go, and I can go grab those fabrics I was talking about. So here we are. We have a like dull army green kind of color rayon crepe, and then a satin that is actually, it was like labeled as like pewter colored, but really, weirdly enough, it matches this green super well. So I was very pleased about that, because weirdly enough, it was like it was meant to be. So good, because it was the only like rayon satin of this type that Mood had, and it just happened to work out. So that was nice. Serendipity, as it were. So now, of course, I need to transfer all of my dart markings onto my pieces. So I was deciding which side of the crepe I wanted to use as the outside here. They're very, very similar. But I can go ahead and transfer my darts for the back here. I'm just going to keep this back dart where it was after separating the midriff piece. I'm just going to keep that there. So I'm just transferring that over, drawing those darts in, again, with some colored pencil and tailor's chalk today. Then I will pinch and pin these darts and set them next to my machine. I am going to run a lot of this through my serger as well, just so that anything that will be raw on the inside will be, or like, because this is not going to be lined, anything that will be raw on the inside will not unravel later on. I did cut out the front and back waist pieces of both the satin and this crepe, however, because I will line just that center waist portion on the inside with the crepe later, because all these areas where, like, normally you might clip a curve, if I had to clip them, which I was hoping I wouldn't because these fabrics are floopy enough to get away with not clipping the curves, which is true, they are. But in case I could, or in case I did have to clip them, I wanted to fully line that area. So I have crepe pieces that I'll show you how I line that area last after this dress has its zipper and hem and everything. So I'll show you that last. But here, again, I'm still just transferring my darts onto the front piece here. The top fronts now, I have 2 darts on that. And then, of course, I'll have to sew the center front seam. When you're doing something like this that has the pointed midriff pieces, or even just a pointed yoke, if you have a center front seam, you can get away with sewing that last. Like, sew the center front after you've sewn the darts, after you've sewn the midriffs to the tops, because it'll be much easier to get a very sharp point that way, just sewing a straight line down the center, as opposed to trying to sew a like inverted corner to a pointed corner. Hopefully that makes some sense. I've shown how to do it here on the channel before in this video, I believe, how to sew a midriff onto the tops when there isn't a center front seam through the midriff, but it is much easier to do it the way I'll be showing today. And I am sorry that I'm leaning over the table so much today. I feel like my head is in the way for a lot of this video. When I was trying to edit it, I was like, get out of the way, kid. But I need to see what I'm doing, which is unfortunate. Again, this top drape piece, it has its dart that I need to mark because I ended up closing that other one. And then the other side I need to, of course, will eventually need to gather down. Let me go ahead and mark this dart on the back here. At this point, you kind of, before you cut this out, you have to decide which side you want the draping to be on, left or right. So you can cut it out with the right and wrong sides of your fabric in mind. I never really care how much my details are on the left or the right, honestly. It doesn't really matter to me. So if I, like, quote unquote mess it up, yeah, I don't care. But I'll pin that dart as well, and again set that next to the machine. We all know how I like to work in batches, as I always say, because I always do. I do have a sleeve for this as well. I never showed anything about that. I'm just using my 3/4 length sleeve. This is drafted from my regular sleeve pattern. It's just shortened to a 3/4 length version, and it's drafted from my regular sleeve pattern. I can put a card up into my regular sleeve here, for those of you who haven't seen that video. Or, I mean, I don't know why you would want to, it's kind of boring, but it's my regular sleeve pattern, I promise. And I have my skirt pieces here as well. Everything just needs to be prepped so that I can run it through the serger, because these sleeves and skirt are not going to be lined in any way, so. But I will go ahead and sew my darts over here on the machine before I serge the front pieces at least. So I'm just sewing from the large end of the dart off the end, and then I will tie the end threads shut along the inside here and trim those down to about 1 inch long, just how I was taught to do darts in fashion school. They taught us several different methods. This is the one that I've stuck with since. So, using a small stitch length here, this is 12 stitches per inch. My machine is in stitches per inch, so I'm sorry, that's just the way I think now. I've been using this machine for a while now. We're very, we have a symbionce. We work together. It's nice. So once I have ironed my darts open, I will take everything over to the serger here. Again, the serger is not used for anything other than this purpose, encasing raw edges, so like the tension on this machine is not great, but it doesn't matter. I just use it as seam binding, basically, because then I don't have to do rayon seam binding, which is a nicer finish, but takes more time, in my opinion. You can always use pinking shears or something else to finish your seams as well. So now I will sew these underarm seam of my sleeve, or the side seam of my sleeve, I guess, and then my shoulder seams for my facing here as well, now that everything is serged, before I get up and press everything over on the ironing board and start pinning the rest. Let's clean up a little bit here. Here's my other sleeve. I only did the one so far. So let me pin the seam of this other one here, set it next to the machine. Once again, I need to make sure everything is lined up properly, so I'm laying my pieces out and kind of looking at them right sides out and then putting them together just so I don't get turned around. And here are my back midriff pieces, my back waist pieces that I can go ahead and sew together here along the bottom of the top of the back. Well, hopefully that makes sense. Here are my front waist pieces here. You can see I have pins in the side seam. Those pins are like facing upwards, so I don't get mixed up with which side of this is up and which side of this is down. I'm just trying to kind of pin within the seam allowance on the satin because it is a little bit more of a sensitive fabric. But I will go ahead and pin the, I guess, yoke seam of this, the waist of the front, to the top bodice pieces as well. This isn't particularly hard to construct, by the way, so that's nice. But just again, right sides together here for this top of the waist seam here. This point does overlap the center front a little bit, by the way. That's just by the nature of how seam allowance works. I'm not lining up, like whenever I'm lining up pieces like this, I'm not lining up this edge to edge. I'm lining this a 1/2 inch in and a 1/2 inch in. I'm thinking about this as seam allowance. So I need the stitching line to be a 1/2 inch in, not right along this edge. So I'm never thinking about the edge matching. I'm thinking about the seam line matching. Hopefully that makes sense. So yes, this does poke out a little bit when you have an angled piece. That is always the case. You'll notice that with like princess seams as well, or even like angled sections when you're color blocking something. That often happens. But that's something to keep in mind. You're not lining up the pieces edge to edge in order for the edges to match. You're lining them up edge to edge usually so that a 1/2 inch in it matches. So that's what really counts. Hopefully that makes some sense. Once again, I'm being confusing as usual. So, some people understand what the heck I'm talking about. That's why there are many of us out here explaining these things, because like learning math in high school, sometimes your teacher explains it and you're like, what? And your friend explains it and you're like, what? And then a third friend explains it to you and you're like, oh yes, because everyone explains things differently, because everyone's brains work differently. So for those of you whose brains are as tangled and convoluted as mine apparently is, you're welcome, I think. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and press those seams. I'm actually going to press these waist seams, or the sections of the waist. I'm pressing this so all the seam allowance is in the waist area, because that's how I'm going to line it later. So all of these, I'm pressing the seam allowance up into the waist or down into the waist, depending on which way I'm working. Right now I'm working on the tops, so I'm pressing that seam allowance down into the waist area. And you were noticing that I was stitching over these pins. That's right, I was. So I have to take them out when I get back over here. This fabric, actually, this crepe, again, singing the praises of this crepe that no one can get access to, including me. It presses very nicely and crisply. I was really appreciative of that. Anyway, now I'm going to sew the skirt portions onto these, so I'm making sure I have the back skirts, sewing the backs onto the backs and not onto the fronts, because it's very easy to get turned around here. So I was keeping things like in different parts of the sewing room so I didn't get mixed up. But I'm sewing the back skirts onto the backs here. like so. And again, I'm going to press that seam allowance up, this time into the waist area. So all seam allowance is being pressed into the waist area. You can see I didn't serge. Anything that was going to be encased in this little waistband lining thing I was going to do, I didn't serge it because I didn't want to add any bulk. So it's bulky enough without adding anything else in there. Now I can do the same for these front pieces. Again, I can pin the skirts on at the bottom of that waist piece. Again, that little triangle sticks out in the very front, but that's what it's supposed to do. So it's good that it does. Like so. But yeah, the textiles really behaved for me, despite being on the floopier side, because they were a bit weightier. Really worked out. I don't think I would want to make anything just in this satin all by itself, but it actually did behave pretty well for a crepe back satin. Not bad. And now that I can press those, again pressing the seam allowance up into the waist section so that I can later encompass it all in my funny waistband lining that you will see at the end. But now that I have everything together on the left and right side of the front, I will sew the center front seam now. Much easier to do it this way to get sharp points at the top and bottom of this waist than it would be to try and sew the waist onto the top and then the skirt onto the waist all in one. Leave the center front seam before, to this point. Please, save yourself the trouble. Believe me, it's much easier this way. Honestly, if you have a style that has this kind of pointed nonsense in the front, and it doesn't have a center front seam, if it were me, I would add one. Because no one's going to notice that seam very much, but from far away, they will notice if your points aren't aligned. So I'd rather have perfectly aligned points and have a center front seam than have no center front seam and have things be a little bit wonky, honestly. If you're newer to sewing and it seems like a difficult task to get these nice sharp points in the front, do it this way. Again, you don't have to follow my advice. I'm not saying I'm the god of sewing or anything here. As usual, whatever way works best for you and gives you a result that you like is the best way to do it. I've been to too many different sewing programs where they tell me this is the only way to do things and they have it different than the last person. So when you've had 6 different sewing professors tell you there's only one way to do this and it's this, and they each have a different method, okay. Then you start to learn, okay, so here's a lot of different methods, pick your fave. Just gonna press up on my center front seam here, now that that is done. Again, this is different than how the Butterick design is done, but I like to have this full dress front and then have the other stuff as an overlay as opposed to try and make it in different pieces. But here's my pointy waist section all finished. And here's my overlay, so I need to put in gathering along this shoulder gathered area. So use basting length stitches over here on my machine. Basting length stitches. Stitches, apparently hard to say. Once I've said too many words, it's like I run out. I don't have many words in my bucket anymore because I don't talk to anyone during the day. I work from home. There's only one employee here at the Closet Historian. It's me. So, I don't talk to a lot of people during the day until I get to talk to you. So sometimes you get weird, mumbly speech version of me instead of articulate me, which is a shame. But I would go ahead and gather this shoulder down so that it's the same length as the other shoulder. Usefully, I can hold it up over here and see if it's the right length. Just use pins to measure that, make sure this is gathered down to the correct size, and then I will tie off the threads so that it doesn't come undone as I do this next step, which is to hem the bottom of this overlay. So I'm just going to turn this to the inside, 1/4 inch and 1/4 inch again, and I actually did go ahead and fell this down by hand with little tiny stitches so that it was nice and finished. Again, this crepe was very nice to work with, so luckily I responded quite well to being hemmed like this, despite being on a curved edge, which was, a little bit harder to hem sometimes. Alright, so now that I have that bottom edge hemmed here, I can sandwich this overlay piece in between the front and back before I sew them together along the shoulder and side seams. So this piece needs to be sandwiched in between. I'm going to go ahead and baste it to the front here. So I'm laying it on top of the front, wrong side on the right side, or like the way it needs to be when finished. So I'm not sewing this right sides together or anything. I'm making this the right side all together now. Hopefully you know what I mean. But I have this overlaid onto the front, and I will baste it at the shoulders and the one side seam where it interacts. I have done this before where I just sandwich it in between the front and back, and it works out fine, but technically I think you probably should baste it, and so that's what I'm showing you today. Pretending that, and again, the weird moments where I choose to do my due diligence. I can't explain myself, as I always say. So I can start lining up the waist seam along the side seams here. I'm lining up one of the backs onto the now whole, front piece, I suppose. But just all along the skirt here, I will sew the long, long, long side seam of the bodice, waist, and skirt all at once. over here on the machine. Just 1/2 inch seam allowance. This does have a few little curves in it, but again, because this fabric was floopy enough, I did not clip those curves. If you're making something like this in like a stiff cotton, you would have to. And if you were doing that, I would suggest maybe doing some decorative top stitching to hold the seam allowance structure in place a little bit better. But with this, it's a floopy fabric. I can press open the curves and it doesn't actually care that much, which is nice. This side, same idea. Layering up the back piece on top, making sure that the waist matches up perfectly, or as perfect as I can get it at least. Is it absolutely perfect? No. Am I a couturier? I should be, but I'm not. As long as it's nearly perfect, that's enough for me. Alright, and now that I have my side seams and my shoulder seams all sewn together, I can go ahead and finish this neckline with its facing. So I'm lining that up right sides together on the outside of my neckline, and I can go ahead and pin the shoulders together first, and then just pin around this curved neckline. So I can stitch this on. I will need to then clip this curve. This curve is small enough that I definitely need to clip it. The wider and less curved the curve, the less you need to clip it. The more acute and small the circle is like this, the more you will need to clip it no matter what. Unless you're using an incredibly loosely woven fabric. But over here I can stitch that on. And then I will do understitching along this facing as well to help hold it onto the inside after I've clipped it. So here I am, just going to clip that curve, clipping down to the stitching, but not through it, of course. Be careful. Also, my scissors are not sharp enough to cut through several layers of this fabric because, again, it is on the thicker side. But just clipping about every centimeter, every 1/2 inch, depending on if you're metric or imperial. I'm just going to press that seam allowance towards the facing here, and then again, stitch it down to the facing by doing some understitching here. So my seam allowance is under my right hand here, and I'm stitching the facing down to the seam allowance underneath, so that all the seam allowance and facing gets sewn together, and then it helps it stay tucked underneath the neckline. Just the nature of the beast. So I can take that over to the end of the ironing board here, and between the end of the ironing board and a tailor's ham, press this neckline into submission using a little bit of steam even, because again, this fabric is on the thicker side. So it required a little bit of finagling. Here, where this interacts with the side seams, or the shoulder seams, I mean, I can pin that to the shoulder seam, and then I will just tack that with a couple of stitches to that shoulder seam allowance as well, so that nothing shows on the outside, but the facing definitely stays curled inside where it's supposed to be. And because this has a center front seam, I can do that along the center front seam here as well. So where you see me putting pins here is where I will eventually throw in a couple of stitches to tack this down. I never show that. It's not like I do it nicely. I just literally throw in a couple of stitches and like whip stitch the facing down to the shoulder seam. And then in this case, also the center front seam. I'll pin that while it's cooling. And now I can put my sleeves in. Woohoo! The rest of the dress is practically constructed. So I'm going to go ahead and put my sleeves in here. Again, I put a single line of gathering stitching along my sleeve caps to curl them over just a little bit like this, because sleeves usually have a bit of ease built into them in the sleeve cap so that it rolls over the top of your shoulder. It's not actually a puff sleeve. The gathering doesn't result in actual like gathering on the sleeve itself. It just helps it roll over the edge. It's like easing in a little bit of extra fabric. You know, sleeves are a different beast. A lot of people call them sleevel and don't like sleeves at all. Me and sleeves get along quite well, knock on wood, so I'm sorry if they are your nemesis. Some other things are my nemesis, I promise you. I can go ahead and stitch that sleeve in over here on the machine real fast. Even faster because of the nature of being able to speed up video. Sadly, I cannot speed up the process in reality. Alright, so now I'm going to press the seam allowance between like the bodice and the sleeve, like towards the arm, so that it kind of almost acts as like a tiny little bit of shoulder padding that like puffs out that area that I was talking about even a little bit more here. So just moving the seam allowance into the like roll over the shoulder and just steaming that a little bit into place. And so now I have my sleeves in. I can go ahead and put my zipper into the back. So from where the zipper ends down, I will sew the back skirts together first. So this is about a 1-inch seam allowance on this because I left myself a full inch down the center back of this for seam allowance for getting my zipper in nicely back here. But I can stitch that. I just marked that with chalk on here because I don't have a 1-inch seam allowance marker on my machine. So I can follow along the chalk line instead. I'm just going to use my hem gauge here and to pin and mark basically and iron out the rest of the seam at that 1-inch fold over, or fold back I guess, so that I have this nice cleanly finished ironed opening in the back here where I can set my zipper in here and stitch it down using my zipper foot over on the machine. I do prefer a lapped zipper, so that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to stitch this first side, the right-hand side, right next to the zipper teeth, and then the other side will overlap the zipper teeth and this little edge a little bit as well. So here's the zipper foot for this machine. You can't move the needle on this machine, I guess, so you have to move the foot around as opposed to the needle itself. Again, this machine is from 1955. It has the modern convenience of having an electric motor attached to it, although it is made of Bakelite, including the foot pedal is also Bakelite. And then the machine does have a reverse stitch, which is nice because not all of these have a reverse stitch on it, but you cannot move the needle, so you have to move, like the presser foot attachments are all built to move the presser foot as opposed to move the needle around. But I'm just using this zipper foot to stitch closely to the zipper teeth here, stitch this first side down. And when I get to the end, I will leave the needle down in the project, lift up the presser foot, move the zipper pull out of the way, put the presser foot back down, and stitch the rest of it. So you're about to see that just here. Leave the needle down, zipper out of the way, presser foot back down. Oop, I clipped my zipper tape a little. And then finish that off. Then over here on the ironing board, I can go ahead and pin this overlapped, hence lapped zipper, but I'm making sure that the points where the waist, band area match up perfectly, because of course, that would be noticeable if it did not. But I'll overlap this just a tiny bit over the stitching basically of that first side, and I can bring it back over to the machine, switch the side of the presser foot, like I was saying earlier, you move the presser foot over. So I'm on the other side now, and again I can feel the zipper teeth through the fabric, and I'm riding the presser foot right along that zipper teeth. So I'm feeling my way around. I can't really see what's happening anymore, but we're hoping for the best, Fold down my facing along the inside of the zipper here, where I can tack that down, finish it off, like so. And I'll put a hook and eye here at the very top of this, and stitch that on just to help this close nicely. I do need to hem these sleeves as well here, so I'm going to turn those twice, just like I hemmed the front drape thing. I'm just going to turn it 1/4 inch twice and hand hem it. Now here are my extra waist pieces, the front and back, that I cut out of the crepe. I'll sew those all together into kind of like a belt. You'll see in just a moment. Like so. And then I'm going to go ahead and press the seam allowance on the top and bottom of this piece under, using nice hot steam here, helping me out. So basically to finish this little belt, like the rest of this dress is pretty much all together, but you can see I'm going to go ahead and pin this waistband lining along the inside here, along that seam allowance that I've pressed towards the waist. Like I pressed the skirt seam allowance up into the waist, I pressed the top allowance down into the waist, and now it's all going to get covered and encompassed in this little waistband lining in here. So I'm just pinning that along, and I will slip stitch that to the seam allowance inside of here. I'm just tucking it underneath the zipper seam allowance over here, just for a sort of clean finish. This was going to be the least bulky way to do that, just because, this fabric is kind of thick. It would be nice to use something even thinner for this, just because I'm only doing this basically as a way to finish the curved edges inside, or like encase them so that they don't fray eventually. It probably would have been fine. Like how often am I going to be like roughly hand washing this? I don't know. But yes, I'm just going to slip stitch all this down, hem my sleeves, hem the dress. I did let this hang overnight, by the way, because some of that eyeline skirt is cut on the bias, and in a heavy fabric like this, I knew it was going to stretch out, so I let it hang overnight, tried the dress on with heels, and had my lovely assistant, aka my mom, help me by pinning my hem for me so that I could cut it straight before I hemmed it. I didn't get any of that on camera for you, though. I'm sorry about that. And here is my finished Butterick dress copy from that Butterick pattern magazine. Again, made out of crepe and satin, just like their suggestion. And I see why they suggested it. It is very fun. And it is very fun to have this like thick, round satin material on my waist. I keep wanting to feel this fabric. So like when I'm wearing it, I'm like rubbing my right waist weirdly, but it's a very fun tactile difference between the rough crepe and the satin. I'm sure I will get a lot of wear out of this dress in the fall and winter time. It is a little bit on the thicker side just because this crepe has a nice weight to it, which is so rare for a modern rayon crepe that I'll just, I'm happy about it, if anything. I hope you enjoyed seeing the results of puzzling this pattern together and really trying to work through this more experimental design for me. This is a little bit outside of my comfort zone, this style in general, just because it doesn't have a waist seam, which challenges me both in the sewing and pattern drafting arena, and also just like in the looking at myself in the mirror arena because I'm used to having that very defined waist, and this is a little bit looser and flowier, free form kind of for me. But do I always need to have something defining my waist? Probably not, even though this almost looks like a corset. So yeah, for some reason this is outside of my comfort zone, even though it's very similar to the other things I wear. But, you know, people are weird. But thank you as always for watching this video today. I'll be back here with more sewing and vintage fashion, costuming, and occasional crafting real soon, and I'll see you then. Bye.